Okay, good morning everybody, and I'm going to give you a round of applause for coming to today's Got Side event. That's all that. That's fantastic. So this side event, we have three speakers who I'll introduce to you now. Everyone's going to speak for around 7 to 10 minutes or so. Is that right?
Yeah.
What we really want to do though is have lots of discussion and open up to the floor. So as people are speaking, do be thinking of questions you want to ask or contributions that you want to make. We're hoping to make this as open a discussion as possible. So my name's James Nicholls. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Transform Drug Policy Foundation, which is a UK-based charity which advocates for drug policies based on human rights, public health and social justice. We also have Suzanne Sharkey to my left, who's the Vice Chair of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership in the UK. We have Diane Goldstein, who's the Chair of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership in the United States and is also a board member of the UK League. And we have Brendan Cox, who's the lead National Support Bureau Director of Policing Strategies. So they'll be able to tell you more about what they do in their presentations. Before they start, I'm just going to do a little bit of scene setting for you, just in terms of the UK scene around police diversion schemes, just to give you a kind of sense of what's happening in the UK, and then we'll move on to the other speakers. So I'll just spend about 5 minutes explaining that to you. So in the United Kingdom, we're starting to see police diversion schemes for what otherwise would be drug arrests expanding across the country, although it's a relatively small start. So we have 43 police forces in the United Kingdom, and 7 of those currently have diversion schemes in place. And I'll talk through what those are in a moment. The context in the United Kingdom for those for the emergence of those schemes, I think there's a number of reasons why they've emerged. Just in terms of arrest numbers, there were 135,000 simple possession arrests in the UK in 2019. But that's happening in the context of severely reduced police resources, which has been an issue in the UK for a number of years. But at the same time, increases in other types of more serious violent crime, including some drug-related violent crime. We have a phenomenon in the UK which is often referred to as county lines, which is a new drug supply networks that have been emerging that often involve young children, and that's taken a lot of kind of police focus. Another kind of major factor in the emergence of diversion schemes, or probably one of the more important ones, is the introduction of police and crime commissioners a number of years ago in the UK, which gave the new PCCs a higher degree of autonomy in deciding how their local forces responded to drug issues. There is, of course, a wider acceptance, I think just kind of more generally across the population, that criminalisation of people for simple possession creates additional harms, or is ineffective, or is just simply not the best use of resources. But importantly, while the political context is that decriminalisation is not national policy in the UK, although the Scottish government is moving towards, or has been in Scotland in particular, there's been calls for national decriminalisation, but that remains politically controversial, certainly with our current government. But diversion as an acceptable local response, diversion schemes, which in many respects has similar characteristics to decriminalisation, it has not actually caused a huge amount of controversy. And again, I'll come back to that in a moment. So the police forces in the UK that currently have diversion schemes, one of the earliest was Durham, and many of you will know Ron Hogg, who sadly passed away very recently, who was the driving force behind that, which was launched in 2015. Avon and Somerset Police launched a drug education programme in 2016. West Midlands Police had a pilot called Turning Point between 2011 and 2014, which was evaluated quite carefully, and they've now recommended to reintroduce that on the basis of that evaluation. 2 Welsh police forces have diversion schemes now in place in the last year. Thames Valley Police has been establishing a diversion scheme. Thames Valley is a very populous area around London. And we also have the involvement of the local police force in a heroin-assisted treatment programme in Cleveland, which has gained a lot of media attention in the last couple of months. And so that's an interesting development as well. The schemes aren't limited to cannabis possession. In many cases, they're for small amounts of other drugs. And in Avon and Somerset, what's interesting is that they have a scheme which also is applied to some levels of supply as well, not just simple possession. So that's quite a development too. The different schemes vary in design. They're not all identical. Some are deferred prosecution schemes, like checkpoints, where on the signing of a reoffending contract and engagement with the navigator, so in Durham it's quite engaged, and you have to sign a contract, you have to engage with the navigator, and that's how your prosecution is deferred. Whereas in Avon and Somerset, for example, it's on-street referral to an education programme, and in Thames Valley you agree to a community resolution. In some of the areas, if you're caught in possession more than once, the second time around, you don't get to go through a diversion scheme. In other areas like Thames Valley, it's an unlimited programme. So there are different experiments going on, and that's, I think, in some ways very useful in terms of assessing the outcomes, although it's very early days, and there's only been a limited amount of actual formal evaluation across the different pieces. In terms of what's made those schemes possible, I think one of the things that's been really significant, not just the infrastructural changes, the development of police and crime commissioners and so forth, but in all the areas, and I'd be interested in what Suzanne has to say about this, in all the areas, individual champions have been absolutely key, I think, in terms of driving this. These kind of innovations always need individual champions, actually. At the end of the day, you will tend to get people who accept the principle or buy into the principle and really drive that forward. I think my microphone's just gone off. Turn it off and on again. There you go. So Ron Hogg in Durham, David Jamieson in the West Midlands, Alphon Jones in North Wales, for example. Senior police officers, there's a DCI called Jason Q in Thames Valley who's been very active in this. But then also civil society organisations like Leap UK have played a very important role in supporting diversion schemes and bringing police on board. Transform has been very involved in many cases in supporting this. Groups like the Scottish Drug Forum. Treatment providers as well, though, in the areas where you have these schemes, the treatment providers tend to be on board. Well, they have to be on board anyway because they're providing the support in many cases, but they're often very supportive. In Avon and Somerset, where Transform's based, for example, the Bristol Drugs Project is very supportive in providing that. There's also national support for the schemes. The Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs is in support of anything that avoids the criminalisation of people for possession. The Home Office accepts that its decision-making is devolved to local forces, so although the Home Office doesn't at a national level promote decriminalisation, they accept that local police forces have the autonomy to make their own decisions on how they carry out their activities. As I said, there's widespread engagement from both small and large service providers, treatment service providers. Interesting, recently there was a report which was signed off with a forward by the Minister, Kit Malthouse, the current Minister responsible for drug policy, which was looking at good examples of police and crime commission activity, and a number of diversion schemes were included in that report, which I thought was really striking in terms of getting a nod from the national leads. And also in terms of local and national media, there's been very little pushback. I mean, there's a couple of things in the Daily Mail, but if anyone lives in the UK, they'll know that you'll always get pushback from the Daily Mail for this kind of thing. But generally speaking, there's been a lot of support, and in Scotland in particular, papers like the Daily Record have been very, very vocal in their support for moves towards this. So just as a few kind of general overall comments then, what I'd say is that diversion schemes in the UK, at least, have attracted very little opposition when they've been introduced. They've generally been supported or kind of not noticed. That's the other interesting thing. It's just been like, okay, well, the police are doing that, that's fine. As more local areas adopt more schemes, they become more viable, they become more attractive, there's more policy learning from one area to another. As I say, local champions have been very important in driving the agenda. National champions, Leap, Transform, and other organisations have been able to support knowledge exchange, share good practice, and promote advocacy. And local evaluations where they've taken place have tended to show quite considerable success. And effectiveness is also starting to be shown in international evaluations of similar schemes. Obviously, more evaluations are needed, more research, as always, is needed, but the evidence so far is very positive. Political support is increasing, and I think there's a growing realisation that schemes like this are both viable, they're implementable, they get support, and they provide significant potential for reduction in the harms of criminalisation as those schemes roll out more widely. Okay, so that's just a very general overview of what's happening in the UK. Obviously, the scenes are different elsewhere. So what I'll now do is I'll pass on to Suzanne, who can talk maybe a bit more about LEAP's role in that and her experience in engaging in those schemes. So,
thanks, James. I'm Suzanne Sharkey. I'm the Vice Chair of LEAP UK. Yeah, it's a privilege and a miracle to be here today to have the opportunity to discuss what has become the necessary and essential role of the police in drug reform. I hope to emphasise the urgent need for not only diversion schemes but harm reduction facilities like DCRs, but for me, ultimately the decriminalisation of people who use drugs. Whilst I've served as a police officer, my perspective is slightly different, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, about myself and the journey to that point. Over 11 years ago, I was actually woke up in hospital and I tried to kill myself again. And at the time, I was a mother, daughter, sister, wife, friend. I had 2 university degrees. I worked as a secondary teacher, and at the end of my career, I was a police officer. Yes, why did I want to kill myself? For me, I was in the depths of an addiction, and I used alcohol and other drugs problematically with catastrophic consequences to myself and those around me. And I thought death would actually be a relief, better for everybody else. I was exhausted. I was exhausted from the daily fight of trying not to use, but failing, every day. And I didn't know what was wrong with me. What I did know, though, was that society had judged me, made me feel more ashamed. It told me I was a bad person, and I failed on all moral fronts. And there was something fundamentally wrong with me, particularly as a mother, a mother that couldn't stop using for her children. Today, actually, I'm over 11 years in recovery from alcohol and other drugs. And the irony is, as a police officer, I worked on a crime team, I was under CID, running operations, running informants, and working as an undercover operative. And at the time, as I was a serving police officer, I thought I was doing the right thing. I really believed that what I was doing was right. These people that were on the streets and in my community, they were breaking the law and they were causing all the problems. Drugs were the problem, and they caused all the problems in the crime that I came across. The people that I was arresting, they were weak, no self-will, no drive to better themselves, and I completely judged them for that. And today, as I sit here, I'm very ashamed that I did think like that. And it's ironic because I became one of those people. I became one of those people on the streets that the police officers arrested. And then looking back at what I actually achieved, had I helped make the communities I served a better and safer place, all those operations, all the time, all those individuals, arrested for supplying, but particularly possession, all the time and money spent, had it actually worked? Had it made it a better community? Did it stop people using drugs? Did it reduce the supply and demand for drugs? Did the enforcement of the drug laws work? Unfortunately, absolutely not. The reality was that I was arresting vulnerable people from poor, socially deprived areas of high unemployment who already had little or no hope. Many of those whose crime was only non-violent drug possession, simply small amounts of drugs for personal use. Or those dealing, which we did arrest, it was the only way that they could make a living to support their families. It was only through the clarity of recovery and meeting countless people, others like me, hearing their stories, that I actually began to question my role as a police officer. Many of those arrests, what they needed help, support, health interventions, treatment, and not criminalisation. So what changed for me? It wasn't the police cells that I ended up in, or the court appearances and the criminalisation that helped me. What they did do is they eroded any dignity I had left, any self-worth, and I was crushed. What I wasn't shown, compassion or empathy, only judgment, further stigmatisation and marginalisation. And I was pushed further into the shadows and made to feel that I was some depraved person lacking moral fibre, that I just had to pull myself together. In the end, for me, the option that was open to me was death. And I thought that was the right choice, and that should never, ever be anybody's best option. For me, it was the people in recovery I had seen on many occasions that had tried to help me numerous times before. When I woke up, they were the ones that were beside me in the hospital bed. No matter what, they continued to support me and showed me that recovery was possible. And they showed me empathy, compassion, understanding, and kindness, just simple kindness. And they treated me like a worthwhile person, a human being, and they nurtured me and loved me till I couldn't do it for myself, until I could do it for myself. And I learned again how to hold my head up, that I was a worthwhile person, that I did deserve to live. And this is what made me want to live again. But then I got very, very angry. Why did it have to get that bad? Why was there seemingly no help? And why did society abandon me? And I'm not looking to blame anybody in particular here, because part of me getting well into recovery was taking responsibility for myself. But I couldn't have done that alone. And then I couldn't sit and do nothing about that. And one of the hardest things I have to face on a daily basis is that people are unnecessarily dying, and these are preventable deaths. And so my journey into drug reform began. What I'm trying to say through my own experience is that one of the biggest barriers that I see of people getting into recovery and maintaining recovery and becoming part of society again is the criminalisation of people who use drugs. Criminalising people who are already suffering is horrific and it's cruel. And for people that use drugs through their own choice, not causing any harm to anybody else, is pointless and it's unjust. And we need to change our approach. Our systems are basically broken. Law enforcement in regards to punitive enforcement of drug laws for well over 50 years, it just doesn't work. And we need to approach the problem differently, but try not to fix what we have, but a completely different approach. For me, just to admit what we're doing is wrong. It's just wrong, it doesn't work. And most importantly, try and right those wrongs. The police do realise that the problem is bigger than them. We can't do that alone. We need other people to help. And they have had to take a lead on this because those in power still refuse to acknowledge that prohibition and the prohibition approach is not working. The role of the police has changed. The face and what we have to face on a daily basis has changed. And the issue of drugs and problematic substance use has reached every corner of our communities and societies that we live in. Everyone in this room will know someone who has been affected by problematic substance use. You might not know that fact about them, but you will know somebody. And for me, drug policy reform is about harm reduction. It's about saving lives and keeping people alive long enough so hopefully they want to live again like me. It's about reaching out a hand to help and support those who are most vulnerable in our societies and show that someone does care. So for me, it's not a case of should drug be leading reform, it's a case of they've had no choice. As James mentioned, at ground level, there is a huge support from services that want to help. But in the political environment that the police are currently under, and the lack of political will, means that we can't wait for direction from our governments, and that they have to take a direction that is best suited for the communities they serve. So hence why I'm sitting here today as a ex-serving police officer, as someone in recovery from problematic substance use, that I'm passionate about trying to be part of that change and encouraging police services, particularly in the UK, where I'm from, to do alternative solutions to the problems that we face from the war on drugs. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for coming to, I think, what is probably from a policing aspect, one of the most critical conversations that we should be having, not just in the United States, but globally and abroad. The Law Enforcement Action Partnership started in 2002 as Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, as a single focus NGO, charitable organization that was made up of current, former, and retired criminal justice professionals across the wide spectrum of United States, and we had some representatives from Canada at that point, that all had worked as career criminal justice professionals and saw the failure of our drug policies. I started in policing in 1983 and I retired in 2004 as the first female lieutenant in our organization in California, and I commanded multiple divisions and worked gang units, and I ran a drug unit as a frontline supervisor. In addition to having a brother who during my entire career suffered from both mental health issues and drug addiction, was dual diagnosed, and ultimately was criminalized for his mental health behavior and died in 2007. And as my views evolved in law enforcement, the one place that I saw is in regards to the enforcement of our drug laws, that all we were doing was ineffectively using our resources and playing in large aspects the largest game of drug war whack-a-mole. Is every time we arrested a drug user, every time we arrested a drug dealer, there were hundreds more users, thousands more dealers, and our goal to get to the kingpin never materialized. And it took a personal tragedy and watching the shame and the stigma of my mother. I was born in Mexico City, and how ashamed my mother was that she had raised a son who had died of a drug overdose. She couldn't even talk about it. It was heartbreaking. And I saw the impact of the mental health system, not just on my brother, but on so many people that we try to help through. Our organization exists solely because of the failure of our drug policy, but it also exists because of the ability for experienced policing professionals that has the courage to understand is dissent is okay, and we need to talk about this, and we need to change this, and we need to be involved in the very, very appropriate public policy discussion and legislating other alternatives to incarceration. So, briefly, I'm taking kind of the philosophical approach of why we're here, and then I'm going to turn it over to solutions until we can sensibly regulate all drugs and end prohibition. So one of the things that people always ask me about is, how did we get here? And I tend to view that our society, especially in the United States, is that we view drug use as a moral failing, and that this has long pervaded and steered the criminal justice system, and it ensures harsh punishments for individuals and communities. The emphasis on using the criminal justice system to treat a clear public health issue additionally diverts critical funding needed for evidence-based substance use disorder interventions. We have competing budgets. We've spent over $1 trillion in stopping and trying to stop drugs from originating outside of our country and inside of our country to no avail. The intended deterrence of drug use through swift, severe, and certain punishments has resulted in damage to public health and the continuation of policing strategies that reinforce structural racism. It has undermined not just American civil liberties, but human rights across the world. And together, it undermines the very legitimacy of law enforcement, the criminal justice system, and their relationship with the communities they are meant to serve. When I was raised up in law enforcement, I was taught that my bosses was not my chief, it was my constituents. That we in law enforcement were peace officers, that we were there to serve people. And yes, sometimes you have to hold people accountable for their violent behavior, but we were there in a role in service to others. And I think that the drug war in particular has done significant damage to that relationship where we're supposed to be working hand in hand to solve our community health and public safety issues. In return, these policies do virtually nothing to prevent drugs from entering our countries, nor to mitigate problematic drug use and its related harms. Rather, they produce harms. Our organization has long stated that drug policy contributes to racism, violence, human rights abuses, addiction, death, and disease. The public knows this increasingly. Years ago, public polling in America showed declining public support for our drug policies and widespread belief that the drug war is a failure. Yet the majority opinion holds little sway over criminal justice professionals' prevailing belief that drug use continues to be a morally flawed choice. At the same time, for all the obstacles and reactionary elements that remain, there's been a tremendous shift among many criminal justice professionals in the last decade in particular, in recognizing that criminalization has not solved America's problems, let alone the world's problems. Many examples of reform are incomplete, I will acknowledge that, and imperfect, yet still represent progress. Evidence includes, in America, a significant crop of prosecutors that have adopted the reform policy and are working to decarcerate and end mass incarceration and alternatives to incarceration for chronic substance use and abuse. There's been a small downtick in nationwide incarceration. There's been implementation of diversion programs, a nationwide law enforcement call for medical assisted treatment in our jails, the appropriate use of methadone and Suboxone, and the recognition of their importance in preventing overdose and death. There's been many incremental reforms and the growth of our organization in particular, but other reform groups and other reform voices in policing. Law enforcement professionals in the U.S. and abroad, not enough, I will grant you that, and I think that's our frustration, but a growing minority can now be calling for safe consumption sites, for syringe exchange programs, for naloxone distribution to both the public and the police, for access to methadone and Suboxone, for pre-booking diversion programs like law enforcement assisted diversion, for drug treatment on demand, for Good Samaritan laws, for drug checking services, for a safe drug supply, and for the decriminalization of all drugs. And I'd like it to note, not decriminalization like America uses, because in the United States, decriminalization still bears a significant amount of collateral consequences. But decriminalization that is a true civil penalty, that's access to the necessary public health treatments, that does more to effectively reduce crime and enhance public safety. Just 10 years ago, in 2010, when I started as a speaker with LEAP, this would have been incredibly unthinkable. And while my colleagues that I work with, both in law enforcement and civil society, share my frustration that the pace of change isn't faster, and many see the pursuit of more radical societal reforms as a better avenue than reforming criminal justice from within, these changes have made crucial differences in people's lives. They will make many more if the momentum continues with the help of people sitting in my audience here. Where we continue to fail, however, is the acknowledgement that the central role of race, class, and other socioeconomic and identity factors in the development and implementation of disaster-targeted drug law enforcement policies. Our government institutions are far too slow in addressing the systemic maintenance of inequalities. The criminal justice field urgently needs to assess how race influences both individual and systemic decision-making and act on those findings. Law enforcement must adopt strategies to end race disparate outcomes and be subject to close, independent scrutiny of these results. The failure to progress in many of these areas is informed not just by law enforcement attitudes, but by the attitudes of many politicians as well. Yet, the motivation behind our emerging attitude is the recognition that the drug war perpetuated hostile relationships in our community, and today's crime policies, which too often rely on jail and prison, are simply ineffective in preserving public safety. So, I'll end this by saying that at least in the United States, there is a lot of good news that's coming out, or a bit of good news, but our work with civil society must continue. A study just released this last year by the Council on Criminal Justice showed that racial disparities have narrowed over the last 16 years in our prison system. The glaring inequalities do continue. I'm not ever going to minimize the glaring racial disparity impact that policing has and drug law enforcement has had in our communities. But it's notable that changes to drug policy and enforcement, when we know that levels of drug use have not significantly shifted, have been critical to this relative progress. And I'll end it with, we have the solutions. You know, the implementation of smart on crime policies and programs like we're going to talk about, alternatives to incarceration, can have a significant impact, but we must have the courage and talk about the elephant in the room. We must call out that we can sensibly control and regulate all drugs through a public health strategy, that we must work to provide diversion and decriminalization schemes that support community health and safety first, and that those schemes must be grounded in a respect for human rights and on harm reduction. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today, and it's great to be here with my distinguished colleagues. And I just want to echo that. I think it's really important that we start to really look at this more from a public health mindset, and to start really taking this out of the criminal justice mindset that we've had for way too long. And I think that's kind of a common theme that you'll hear today that we're here to really talk about. So I'm Brendan Cox. I'm currently the Director of Policing Strategies for the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion National Support Bureau, which is an initiative that is a pre-booking, pre-arrest diversion program that allows officers at the point of contact when somebody commits a law violation to use their discretion to divert that person away from the criminal justice system and into a really intense case management, harm reduction based initiative that keeps them away from the system. And it's very low barrier, starts to help build a relationship with a case manager. The only thing the person needs to do is an assessment, and that assessment just really helps us to build what it is that that person's going to work on, that we're going to get them figure out what that help is. And I'll go into how that ultimately came to be in a minute. I'm also a speaker with LEAP. I'm proud to be that. And prior to being with LEAP, my prior lifetime was with the Albany, New York Police Department, and I was there for 23 years. I retired there in 2017 as the chief of police. And I'll echo some of the other comments here today. When I began my career in 1994, simply put, we were full bore into the war on drugs. And I'd love to sit here today and say the war on drugs is over, but I think everybody in this room can admit that the war on drugs is not over, no matter how many people might try to say that. But in 1994, as a young cop, I thought that arresting people for simple drug possession was actually going to help them out. And I know that's not true. So 25 years later, a lot of folks have shown me the way. I've seen a lot of the evidence, and I know that that's not true. I know that the criminal justice system is not the place to help people with substance use disorders. It, in fact, is going to harm more people than it's ever going to help people. It's not where to get people help. It's not a humane place to help those that are suffering from substance use disorders. And the simple fact of the matter is punishment does not change people's behavior. And we have shown that over and over again in the United States. We lead the way when it comes to mass incarceration. We not only have the highest rates of incarceration, we have the most people incarcerated in the world. And we have tried this experiment for a long time. We have not ended our experiment, and we have not changed that the evidence that punishment does not change. So we had this big 700% increase in incarceration rates. It stayed pretty much steady. And I tell people all the time when I throw this question out to young cops and say, so if we had a 700% increase in incarceration, should have the rates of drug use gone down or up? And folks are like, well, it should go down. It's like, well, they went up. So if incarceration didn't cause those rates of drug use to go down, and if our last 10 years of people dying of overdoses increasing didn't cause those to go down, then maybe we need to find a different way, because punishment clearly has not worked. And of course, we wound up ultimately creating mass incarceration. And while in the US we've had some reform-minded folks and some reform-minded states start to change things like how we look at cannabis, we've also started to see things like enhancements. So we have states that are looking to enhance penalties for things like fentanyl as opposed to heroin. So we have not learned from our mistakes like we did with crack cocaine compared to powder cocaine, where we did this 100-to-1 ratio from the federal government. That's still 18-to-1. That had a huge disparate reaction when it came to especially people of color. So we have not learned those lessons. So we need to do that. So how do we change that narrative? Well, one way we can change that narrative is through LEAD, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. So back in 2011, one of the ways to attempt to move away from the war on drugs and specifically racial disparities within the criminal justice system when it comes to arrests in drug offenses. So in Seattle, one of the things that was happening was in the Belltown neighborhood of Seattle, which folks that are not familiar with Seattle or have seen maybe tourism commercials, where the Pike Fish Market is, where the folks throw fish to each other. And by the way, if you ever go there and want to see a fish thrown, just take in mind that you'll have to buy that fish. So if you ask that to happen, be prepared to ship that home wherever you live. They had an open air drug market, and they were making a lot of arrests. That was the tool the police had. But ultimately, for a city that's 8% African American, the number of folks that were being arrested were over 60% African American. So there was a recognize that they could do things differently. So an unprecedented collaboration, and that's what we ultimately need, of folks came together to do something different. So there were police, prosecutors, civil rights advocates, public defenders, political leaders, mental health and drug providers, housing providers, business and community leaders came together and ultimately found an innovative way to solve problems for individuals who frequently cycle in and out of the system. And I want to stress that, frequently cycle in and out of the system. This is not about first-time offenders. In my opinion, first-time offenders shouldn't come in the door. There should be other ways. This is about folks that frequently come in and out of the system and that we have not found better ways to deal with. That instead of the approach of arrest, prosecution, and incarceration, to find a different way. And I'll say this, arrest, prosecution, and incarceration does not equal public safety. There are some folks that do need to be incarcerated, but for low-level offenders, arrest and prosecution does not always equal public safety. So in LEAD, police officers exercise their discretionary authority at that point of contact to ultimately bring individuals to a community-based harm reduction program. And I stress harm reduction. There's a recognition that not everybody is ready, willing, or able to make large changes. There's a recognition that not everybody is ready to become abstinent. So that's a little counterintuitive for police at times. We feel like, hey, somebody's got to stop using drugs if they're going to go ahead and be in our program. But there's a recognition that, hey, when we arrest people, they don't all stop using drugs. So some of this is about being a grown-up and recognition that people don't just change overnight. And now when we want people to stop using drugs, there are some people that will never stop using drugs. My drug of choice is not in front of me today. I usually have a big cup of coffee and I go see a neurologist for migraines, and I'll tell you this, he tells me all the time I need to stop using coffee, and I laugh at him and say, give me my prescription for my drugs. I'm leaving. I will drink my 20 cups of coffee today and see you later. So at its core, LEAD builds a foundation to provide a long-term system of care. Stress long-term again. Folks live through a lot of trauma, or folks with problematic substance use. That didn't grow overnight. That took time. So a long-term system of care that looks at a long period of time to allow more permanent changes that increase positive change in a person and public safety outcomes. Because public health approaches can create public safety outcomes. And LEAD is a public safety program. LEAD acts as that valve to direct the person into the right set of solutions, not predetermined programming. And I can't stress that enough. We can't take everybody and put them into a cookie cutter program. We have to recognize that everybody is different, and we have to deal with people as individuals. And when we don't do that, we tend to fail. We tend to fail for folks. When we say, hey, you have to do this one thing, that's when people fail. And that's one of the mistakes that I think we have to make sure we don't do. And it's when, no offense to anybody who goes direct to treatment, but when we tell everybody they got to go to detox or treatment, that's when we fail them. And then we're surprised when they're back on the street, still using, or God forbid, they're dead. Because that's ultimately the truth of the matter sometimes when that happens. So LEAD in the US is now in over 60 jurisdictions. So the US has 18,000 police agencies. I'd love to say that I can get to all 18,000 police agencies and get them on board. We're getting there slowly. But we are in all the way from the second largest jurisdiction in the country in LA to very small jurisdictions like Schoharie County, New York, which is west of me in Albany, New York. So that's a very small farming community of 30,000 people. And we're also starting to go international. We've had interest in Kyrgyzstan, which is running a LEAD-like program, Vietnam, and I just came back from South Africa last week, so we have a lot of folks internationally that are interested. And LEAD has not only grown in size, but in scope. So when Seattle started, it was for drug possession, drug sales, and sex work. One of the things that we've done is expand the scope. So when we started in Albany, one of the things, the charges I gave to my officers was said, look at the New York State penal law, and let's look at crimes that we know that are driven by addiction, mental illness, homelessness, and poverty, and let's divert those crimes. So that's opened the door to be able to say that, hey, somebody that's committing a larceny, shoplifting, if that's driven by the fact that they can't pay their bills and they're stealing to support their family, the criminal justice system is not going to help them either. Or the same matter, if they're stealing to support their substance use disorder, let's get them the help, because let's get to the root cause of the issue. Because as chief of police, if my job is to drive crime down and keep people safe and help people, well, if I just keep on arresting the same shoplifter over and over again, I'm not doing any good. Like our first diversion was a shoplifter who also had an addiction to heroin and needed help. And we had arrested him 44 times previously. Well, a 45th bite at the apple didn't really seem like that was going to make a change to arrest. So we know LEAD works. LEAD is evidence-based. Recidivism dropped by 58% in the LEAD participants as compared to folks that went through the normal system. LEAD ultimately improves outcomes. It also saves money. In reality, though, we should spend more money on LEAD participants than we do, because at the end of the day, it should be about getting the help they need. It should not be about leaving people unhoused. We do that far too often in the United States. It also improves relationships between police and community. And I can tell you that that is desperately needed. In my community, I can tell you that in Albany, at times, we had a very, 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 very bad relationship with our communities, especially communities of color. And I can tell you that in the war on drugs, we took far too many, especially young men, out of the community, and young men of color. We sent them away. We took them away from their families. And then when they came back, we said, you can't live with your family because they live in subsidized housing. You can't vote because you have a felony. And by the way, you got to get a job, but nobody will hire you because you have a felony conviction. So we need to change how we do that. We also know that so for me, one of our major civil rights leaders approached our department to say, hey, can you look at this program? Can you look at LEAD? Well, think about that. If a civil rights leader is willing to come to a police chief and say, can we do this? That opens a huge door. So when I can go out with a civil rights leader to the community and say, we're doing this together, that ultimately helps create that, that healing method with the community. So one of the things that we're here to say, though, also is that police leaders are being forced to find creative ways to get the criminal justice system out of the way to help people, not punish them. LEAD, in many ways, is a de facto decriminalization. And I agree with Diane about that definition. Not decriminalization the way we define it in the US. In New York, we've said we've had decriminalization in marijuana and cannabis for years. We still send plenty of people to jail for that. The same thing I used to challenge people to when I was the chief of police, put me out of business. LEAD does not want to be here 25 years down the road. LEAD wants to help change laws so we can stop all this nonsense of continuing a war on drugs. I challenge people to that as chief of police. I left voluntarily. I wasn't put out of my job in that way. I'd like to be able to say someday that I was put out of my job and leave. So let's change the laws. Let's end the war on drugs. We know that our antiquated drug policies keep the war on drugs running strong. We have far too much evidence to know that harm reduction methods save lives, yet while people continue to die, other people make moral arguments around being against safe consumption sites, being against fentanyl testing strips. So we have this whole argument about people saying people are chasing fentanyl, yet when we talk to drug users, they say, I don't want fentanyl. I want to go back to heroin, which is safer, but I can't find heroin because we've cut off the supply. And what do? We continue to drive the supply market as well as create issues. Syringe exchange, I still talk to people in states that want LEAD in the US, but syringe exchange is still not legal. We need to change that. And ultimately, those moral arguments only further to stigmatize the people we're trying to help, and they truly have no legitimacy behind them because ultimately they are solely based on people's moral standards, not on evidence. So I'll end my comments where we kind of started out with this theme. Police are heading the reform because they know the reform is needed and they can't wait for that official reform to happen. I got to ask that all the time in Albany. Why are you doing this, Chief? Well, because I'm not waiting, and Albany is the capital of New York for folks that are not from the States, because I couldn't wait for the people that were less than a mile away from my office to actually make the changes. So ultimately, we know that we need to implement things like LEAD because we can't wait for politicians to actually go ahead and get together in the same room and make those changes we need to have them made. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Thank you so much to the panel for those presentations. They were really insightful and moving and powerful. So I'd now like to open this up to the floor for questions. I'm sure people have things they want to ask or clarifications or anything like that. So I'll take answers as they go. There's a There's one here, one here. Maybe we'll take these two questions together, one after another, and we'll see what we can do.
Hi, thanks, Matt. It's Erin Layman from Australia. It's terrific to hear examples of police leading a voice for change, but often police are opponents for any harm reduction strategies. And James, you talked about the importance of champions. So I'm just interested in the thinking of the panel on strategies to build champions and strategies to deal with some of our greatest opponents to any harm reduction attempts.
My question is about decriminalization, because you say that there's a wrong model like New York, as I heard, that people being officially is cannabis decriminalized, but you have to show your pockets probably, and you end up for some moral issues in prison. So, and also in Portugal, there are some example of something going back. So I think the full regulation is much better, and so you are in between. But can you explain more about this decriminalization thing?
So let me touch bases on, in the United States in particular, decriminalization comes with significant collateral consequences. And that's why, although our organization supports this very needed incremental step, and let me be very clear, true civil decriminalization like Portugal, for example, would be a good incremental step towards treating chronic substance use disorder from a public health strategy. But the problem in the United States is our decriminalization comes with collateral consequences. So even for something as simple as cannabis, if you get a ticket for cannabis, you're not supposed to go to jail. But in our laws in certain states is if you don't show up for court, they issue you a warrant, which then becomes a misdemeanor. And then if you don't show up for court, you can get arrested under that warrant. And then if you still don't take care of it, they suspend your driver's license. And it starts just kind of this cycle of perpetuating people into losing their jobs, going into jail. And so when we talk about decriminalization, I would like to see, at least at a minimum, a start of a true civil infraction where you can't go to jail, where you can't get sent to a debt collector, where you don't become involved in coercive drug treatment, because we rely very much so in the United States on drug courts. And I think drug courts are problematic because they are, a large number of them, cherry pick the best individuals that are going to be successful, and they marginalize those people who are committing really, underlying offenses that we need to have in programs like Chief Cox talked about.
Yeah.
So to the question too about officers and harm reduction, yes, there are absolutely some pushback from officers. So one of the things that we try to do when we do our training, we do a large component on harm reduction to take away, number one, some of the myths, but to also let officers ask whatever questions they want and to put it in real perspective about what harm reduction is going to be, and to talk about the fact that harm reduction is also about, and lead specifically, but harm reduction is about more, not less. Like, this is about the fact that that person's going to get more help, not less, and the fact of some of the different realities that are played in and what those officers are going to see. And when we have those honest conversations around harm reduction, and especially when we'll even use examples about the things that law enforcement does to reduce harms for themselves, to make it safer for them. Once we kind of put those things together, a lot of people have that kind of aha moment. And then, yes, we do try to find those champions within the departments that are able to push a lot of those things. And the most amazing thing is to find those key stories. We tell them at first from outside, but there's nothing better than when there's a successful diversion and when it's an alternative method of help to an individual and they succeed, that all of a sudden there's true buy-in. Like, we had a young lady who was using heroin. She was using it to ultimately deal with some trauma she had gone on in early life. She ultimately asked to get her high school equivalency certificate and get a job. And at first the officers are like, this is insane, like, she needs treatment. And the case manager was like, this is a harm reduction approach, give me a little bit of time. And she succeeded not only in getting her equivalency diploma and a job, but ultimately in reducing her use and then stopping her use. And all of a sudden the officers were like, we get this works. So a lot of times it's finding that real example and having them recognize what it is and then telling their own peers how that's worked.
Suzanne, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just add to, because obviously it's getting to the police officers, the people in charge that can become the problem. And what I've found is, I don't like it, but as a person with lived experience, it's really important that those stories are told. And so, and it comes down to money. A lot of it's to do with budgeting, and this parent-assisted treatment's just started in Middlesbrough. It's only 11 people on that, but the cost to the NHS, the policing, was like 3.5 million between them, and the cost of parent-assisted treatment for them is 11,000. And out of those 11, only one person has actually sort of gone back into the criminal justice system, if you like. But the importance of lived experience of, with all the police interventions, like we had one guy that had something like 536 criminal interventions, 2 health interventions, and the cost. And he's actually now in recovery. It's through a 12-step program. So, but yeah, absolutely costs nothing to society now. And again, these are people that are time and time again in and out of the criminal justice system, which has, like Brendan was saying, absolutely no benefit to them at all. But those people with lived experience that have been in it and had treatment, that hopefully can win. I'd say police officers that have a little bit of a heart. So
We've probably got time for one more question. We've got actually what to quickly take to. We'll have to do them very quickly. So take this gentleman and this gentleman.
Thanks. I'll be real quick. Mike Sear from British Columbia, Canada. I'm a chief of police just outside of Vancouver. Fully support what you're doing. We have a diversion program in our community, and 100% love your leadership and where you're going. My question is, and my biggest frustration is I can move towards a diversion model. All my officers are doing that. I don't have health standing up the resources that they require to support the people that we're diverting. So, and that's outside of my budget line, and I try to get some influence, but challenging. Can you please speak to that?
Yeah. And should we quickly just take this question here as well?
Thank you. I'll be real quick. I'm from drug enforcement from Mauritius. Just wanted to know, because you mentioned that UK has 43 police forces. So, do you have a standard police diversion scheme applicable to the whole 43 forces, or do each force apply their own discretion?
Okay, I'll answer that very quickly. No, there isn't. It's not a standard one across the board. And the ones that are have their own diversion schemes are doing it slightly differently, and so there's variation across the forces that are introducing it. So.
And the key piece for us is ultimately the case manager. So it's not necessarily creating the extra services that ultimately are still needed. It's creating that case manager that gets attached to that person, that sticks with that person, that ultimately holds their hand till they get them through all those different pieces. If there's extra money in a budget, we can buy some of those different services, but unfortunately, those services don't necessarily get expanded. But what gets expanded is that case manager and the ability to work with that individual and stick with them until they can get them into that service.
I think the most difficult part about all this is also the competing budget issue and the resources issue. Is in order for a successful lead model, for a successful program to work, you have to have buy-in from every part of the governmental services. And one of the things that we see in the United States is for those law enforcement folks that are kind of opposed, one of the reasons that they may be opposed is that because it could potentially take a chunk of money from their budget as well. And so, it's what comes first, the chicken or the egg. And I have long said is that we have not successfully budgeted for front-end programs, behavioral health services, public health services, education, job training, treatment, the whole entire gamut that is so critically important for having communities that are healthy and safe. And what's happened, and I think one of the important things here is law enforcement is tasked with trying to solve societal problems without being given the necessary tools. The most smart tools are not jail. And so we have to work together, and I think that's the thing is where we've been successful, is we have had lived experiences with people who use drugs mothers who lose their children to drug abuse or the criminal justice system. And we have gone in together, united as a front, to our legislators, because they're the people ultimately that hold the purse strings. They're the people that you're going to have to convince. And you and I can have a whole discussion about logging law enforcement afterwards, because it's a huge issue.
Yeah, I should quickly add on too. I should have said this. So LEAD is considered a collaborative approach. So it's not owned by one agency. So those should be partners at the table. And we have also been able to use that collaborative approach to sometimes find some of the things that we don't necessarily couldn't before prove that were happening, and call those partners to accountability and say, hey, you need to stop this process that you're doing that's hurting our participants, and get them to change. So that has helped, having that collaborative approach.
Okay, it's 5 to 9, and I have to go and share another session now. 9 o'clock, so I'm really rolling this morning. Listen, thank you all. Can we give the panel a warm round of applause? I think that was a fantastic session. So thank you all so much. Thanks for coming.